It was such a fun read, and it was my favorite in the entire series. It has enemies to lovers. Let me just paint the picture here. Hello. I have been doing YouTube for over 7 years and I'm still super nervous. My name's Sarah. I live in Korea, Seoul, with my husband. We run a main channel together. I decided to finally start my own book channel. I love to read, I love to talk about books. I am someone who likes to savor my books and read at kind of a leisurely pace. I'm not one of those people who reads like 200 books a year. I think my videos are going to be more smaller, curated book reviews and chats. So for the first video on this channel, I thought, why not kick it off with my favorite books that I read in 2022. I'm a little late to the party, but better late than never. Without further ado, let's get into those books. So these books aren't going to be ranked in any particular order. The first one being The Last Green Valley. So if you've caught any videos on our main channel, you'll probably know that I really love historical fiction, and this one in particular really blew me away. I feel like it's focused on an area of World War II that I didn't learn all that much about, so I felt I learned a lot from this book. It's based on a family story during World War II. It focuses on this couple, Emil and Adeline, and they live in Ukraine, which was at the time the Soviet Union under Stalin. It's 1944. The Germans are being pushed out by the Soviet army, and they are caught in this really weird position because their family are ethnic German. Even though they've been living there for over a century, they either have the choice of Stalin's soldiers coming to them and imprisoning them in a gulag, prisoner of war camp in Siberia, or they can go along with the retreating Nazi forces who have offered to protect the ethnic German families, by the way, on the way out, and basically make their way out of the Soviet Union, out of Ukraine, and start a new life somewhere else, hopefully safely. I actually wasn't so familiar with the Germans' history in Russia. Basically, during Catherine the Great's reign, she opened up the country to Germans to invite them to come because many of them were experts in agriculture. And she wanted their skills, she wanted them to teach the locals their skills, and as a result, years later, there were generations of ethnic German families living in Russia, Soviet Union, Ukraine at that time. So Emil and Adeline ultimately decide to leave, and they take their 2 sons and their families, and this book is basically about their journey evacuating Russia / the Soviet Union / Ukraine at that time, and all the shit that goes down, where they end up, how they plan on starting a new life, the hardships they go through. It's a really intense and really beautiful book. As I mentioned, I also feel like I learned a lot about this chunk of World War II that I don't really feel like gets a lot of spotlight. So for those of you who are really into historical fiction, particularly World War II historical fiction, I highly recommend this one. Next up is a much more lighthearted book. We've got The Maid. I actually read this book in Canada over the summer because a family friend lent it to my mom, and I was like, yo, can I read this before you do? Because I've only got a month here. And I blew through that book. It was such a fun read. It's kind of a light-hearted and funny murder mystery, if that makes any sense. It's basically about this young woman named Molly. She has trouble with social interactions and social cues, and she can't really read people that well. She also has a love for cleaning, cleanliness, order, manners, which makes her perfect for her job, which she loves, and she is, you guessed it, a maid at the Regency Grand Hotel. She is so passionate about her job, she's incredibly happy there, and one day when she goes to clean one of the rooms, she finds a dead body, and she becomes a suspect in the investigation as a result. So the man she found dead is basically a very prominent, rich, successful figure, and the story kind of goes along how they're going about trying to solve this murder, the motives, who did it, while also being in Molly's head as the point of view throughout this story. And there's so many funny moments because she doesn't really get certain expressions or figures of speech. For example, she mentions that the tabloids refer to this now deceased man as a silver fox, but she says, just to clarify, he is neither silver nor a fox. So like those kind of things, if you're looking for kind of a not too thick book, lighthearted, a little bit mysterious and funny read, this is the perfect book for that. Next book. I'm trying not to play favorites, but it's hard not to with this one. It is A Court of Mist and Fury. So earlier this year, I read the entire series of A Court of Thorns and Roses, and I loved it. A Court of Mist and Fury is a masterpiece, and it was my favorite in the entire series. It is the second book. It's a little bit difficult to go into detail with this one since it's the second book in this series, and there's some like major spoilers in it for the first book for those of you who haven't read it. Let me just paint the picture here. So this is a fantasy novel, and it takes place on this continent called Prythian. This continent is divided into sections. So the kind of bottom crappy section is the mortal realm, basically where humans live, and the larger top and middle section is the fairy realm, and it's divided into these different courts. So we've got the spring court, the autumn court, winter court, summer court, night court. The main character is Feyre. She's 19 or late teens, I believe, and she's living in the human realm and she's not having a great time. Her family lives in severe poverty. They barely have enough to eat, and she goes out hunting one day to catch some food since she's the only one who can and bothers to do so. During that hunting trip, she sees a massive wolf in the forest, and she's like, holy shit, this is either gonna kill me or I have to kill it. She kills it. She goes home with the pelt. Maybe she can trade it for something later. Turns out it wasn't a wolf at all. It was actually a fairy that could shapeshift, because some of them have those abilities, and she gets in huge shit for that because she's not supposed to be killing fairies. Actually, humans and fairies aren't supposed to be crossing that line between the two realms. So because she killed this fairy, and it is against this treaty that was formed between humans and fairies, she is taken into the fairy realm to live out the rest of her days there as punishment. So it's kind of got this Beauty and the Beast feel to it too, because among the spring court where she's staying with this said fairy who is the lord over the spring court, there is this curse, and they're trying to break the curse. The first book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, I liked it. It was good. I did think that in the first book, Sarah's writing was a little lackluster, a little repetitive, a little cliche. But when it ended, I was like, hey, okay, that was fun. I'm kind of curious what happens in the second book, so let's give it a go. It was so much better. It was adventurous. It has enemies to lovers. It has our main girl making lots of progress and healing and becoming a better version of herself. And it has chapter 55. I can't go into any more details because I feel like I've already said enough, but something that is so important to me, reading a series of books like this, I must love the characters. I love characters who are really well written, and most importantly, they have great chemistry with each other. And this book / this series does, specifically the Night Court crew. So if you're into fantasy books, fairies, a little spice, this series is chef's kiss. Read it, please. So a little pivot for the next book, very different genre. We have Memphis. As soon as I read the very first opening line of this book, I was like, holy shit. It was hard-hitting and it was potent, and I was like, I think this is gonna be a really good book. And I loved it. So this book basically tells the story of 3 generations of Southern Black women. And it starts out with our kind of main girl. She's 10 years old, her name is Joan. Her and her mom and her sister left their dad because he's abusive, and they're fleeing to her mom's ancestral home in Memphis where her sister is living. So there are different POVs, and it's a non-linear timeline, but it's not confusing at all. I actually love how these chapters were structured. So all the main characters, all the POVs are women, and each chapter is named after the woman who is the POV for that particular chapter. So it talks about Joan's grandmother, how she met their grandfather, when he built the house, the racism that was going on at that time. It also tackles abuse, sexual assault. There's some pretty heavy stuff in here, but along with it, it's just beautiful how it portrays the love and support that these women give each other and their resilience. I was so happy to see that this book is one of the best sellers on the Amazon Kindle store. I was like, yes, this deserves to be on that list for sure. Next up, we have another World War II historical fiction, my weakness, and this one is called The Paris Network. Where did the sunlight go? So this story has two timelines, one in 1993 and the other one in 1939 throughout World War II in France. And in France, we've got our main girl, Laurence. She lives in this quaint little village and she runs her own bookshop. And actually a special little thing that she does is she writes what she calls book prescriptions for people. So depending on the individual and their mood, she will write something like, read this page and passage on page 62, and they'll buy that book, and it's basically the coolest job ever. So of course, this is World War II. The Nazis come in, Germans are now occupying France, and they're doing some pretty horrible shit. One of the things that we all know the Nazis did in World War II was make a banned book list. Laurence, being a bookstore owner, doesn't like this one bit. So to kind of rebel and resist, she kind of forms this little book club where her and some very close friends secretly read these banned books together. And then it kind of escalates to her becoming a part of the French resistance, where they are passing these secret messages inside books by kind of underlining different words and passages. It's actually really cool. So fast forward to 1993, in our other timeline, we have Jean or Jan, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name. She has just lost her mother, and she finds out that, strangely enough, she has inherited this small bookshop in this little quaint village in France. And she has no idea why. But her dad seems to know some stuff. They end up going to France together to figure out what is going on behind that story. Look, I love a good World War II historical fiction book where there are strong women in there, and I thought the whole aspect of being in the resistance and resisting through books was such a cool touch. So it was definitely one of my favorite World War II historical fiction books that I've read. Okay, next up, you will probably remember me talking about this book if you watch our main channel, because I was gushing about it there. It is As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow. And Carrie, bless her heart, gifted me this book along with a few others when we met up a few weeks ago, and I love this book so much. So right off the bat, this book is pretty heavy at times because it takes place during the Syrian Revolution. Our main character, Salama, she's this, I believe, 18, 19-year-old girl. Before the revolution started, she was a student. She was studying to become a pharmacist, and then the revolution started, shit hit the fan, and now she is a doctor slash nurse. Even though she's not qualified for that, she's just a pharmacy student in a local hospital because of the bombings and the shootings. She's basically tending to people who they have these horrific injuries, and there's very few qualified doctors or medical personnel, and that is where she's needed, so that's where she is. So she lives with her best friend Layla, who also is her sister-in-law because she's married to Salama's brother, and Layla is pregnant. So basically, Salama has this huge dilemma, and it is, do I want to abandon my homeland and abandon my post at this hospital where my services are incredibly essential, or do I stay here doing what I'm doing, and my sister-in-law and I and her baby will probably die here anyway? Yeah, so she's in that kind of position. An interesting part of this book is that Salama's trauma and anxiety and fear has kind of manifested itself into this being slash character that only she can see and converse with, and his name is Kaf. And actually he's described as being like really hot. So Kaf basically is trying to keep her safe by regurgitating and bringing up all these terrible memories of stuff that has happened to her, and basically showing her things, terrible things that could happen if she doesn't do X, Y, or Z, or if she tries to do X, Y, or Z. So during all of this, working at this hospital, which is extremely traumatic, worried about her sister-in-law who's gonna give birth soon, she meets a boy, and they connect, and they really like each other, and she still has to make that decision whether she is to stay or leave Syria. So needless to say, there were a fair share of very heavy and traumatic moments in this book, given the setting. It was also really beautiful in many ways. The boy that she likes, the flashbacks when she's talking about these wonderful moments with her family, it was really, really beautifully written. And I can't believe actually this is the debut novel for the author, so I mean, I can't wait to see what else she comes out with. I loved this book. The next one I had heard so much about before I read it. I finally caved and gave it a go, and I'm so glad I did. It is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. So this is another historical fiction book. It's got two timelines. The present timeline is basically Evelyn Hugo was once one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, and she contacts this journalist out of the blue. She's not even a very prominent journalist, and she wants this specific journalist to write her biography. So the story goes back and forth between them meeting up for this interview and talking about her life and what she wants to cover in this book, and the flashbacks to these actual events in her life in a lot more detail. The story starts out with how she got into Hollywood in the first place, the difficulty, the sexism that women faced at that time just to be able to get into that world. The character, Evelyn, is a ball buster. I love her. She doesn't take shit from anyone. She's very headstrong. She's very determined. When she sets her mind to something, she just does it. I honestly didn't even read the synopsis of this book before I got it, and I was really pleasantly surprised to see that the book focuses on the difficulties that the LGBTQ community had in old Hollywood. The main love story in this book was just absolutely beautiful, so well written. I have no words. It was just such a wonderful story. I love the author's writing style. There wasn't one moment in this book where I felt the story dragged on too much or it was rushed. The pacing was perfect. I can definitely see why this is one of the best sellers of the past year. Alright, we are finally at the last book. This was a very loved one. It's called Miss Benson's Beetle. And I actually just randomly stumbled across this book when Amazon Kindle store just kind of recommended it to me, and it was on a really good sale at the time. And I thought, oh, that sounds cute, why not? Am I so glad that I ended up purchasing this book. This book stole my heart. It's historical fiction set in England in 1950, so it's just kind of fresh after World War II. Everyone's still feeling the after effects of the war. So our leading lady is Marjorie Benson, and she is pushing 50, she's unmarried, and she works as a school teacher, and she is incredibly unfulfilled in her life. She's described as being kind of tall and big-boned and awkward, and throughout her whole life she's basically been kind of teased for that, including at her job, at school, and it's another typical workday for her. She's teaching class, and she finds a note these students are passing around, and it's basically a poorly drawn caricature of her, and she just kind of snaps. Not angrily, she just leaves the school, walks out, and she decides that she is going to follow a dream that she's had since she was a small child. So when she was a child, her and her father were really passionate about insects, and they would study insects together. He had this whole collection of books with these beautiful pictures in it, and they would always talk about this rumored mythical golden beetle that was said to have been spotted, but there was no proof that it actually existed. So she makes the decision that day that she is going to drop everything, use her life savings to travel to New Caledonia, where it is rumored that's where that beetle was spotted, and she wants to find it. Now, she doesn't speak French, so she puts an ad in the newspaper that she's looking for an assistant who can travel with her to New Caledonia, who can speak French and help her get around, and there's barely any replies, and she ends up going with this younger woman who is basically her polar opposite, who is hilariously underqualified, named Enid. It's basically this story about this very, very unlikely friendship while searching for this mythical golden beetle in the jungles of New Caledonia and basically starting a new life. It was a total fluke that I found this book, but I'm so glad I did. This book was an absolute delight. If you're into books about female friendship and a good adventure and a little bit of comedy, there's moments where you're gonna laugh, there's moments where you're gonna cry. It is a phenomenal book. All right. Okay, so those were my personal favorite reads of 2022. I am literally sweating right now because I was so nervous. I'm still very awkward in front of the camera by myself, so please bear with me. I hope I can get a little more comfortable with the whole idea. Let me know if you guys have read any of these books that I've talked about. What did you think about them? And what are some of your favorites of 2022 that were not on this list that you would recommend? Because I'm always looking for new suggestions. Thank you so much for watching this very first video on my book channel, and I hope to see you guys again very soon. Bye!